Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, audiophiles and music lovers. Today we'll be reviewing the YG Acoustics Talus loudspeakers and Descent subwoofer. I hope you enjoy it. Okay, before we get into the body of today's review, let's talk a little bit about YG Acoustics, the company, because there have been some changes and it's helpful to know about those because they kind of set the context for how these loudspeakers are designed. YG Acoustics has been around for more than 2 decades, and during that period I would say they've established themselves as one of the premier US designers and builders of high-end loudspeakers. Like Wilson and Magico, YG uses cone drivers in a cabinet and applies sophisticated engineering and manufacturing technologies to push the state of the art. YG has developed a devoted following in various countries, but I think it's fair to say that YG has been positioned, at least in the US, generally as the third member of this mainline triumvirate. That, however, may change. In the past few years, YG has installed a new management team with the capabilities and energies to advance the YG cause. Sometimes, I hate to say it, when a company passes from its founding generation to a new generation, the road is a bit rocky and you get the feeling that some of the special sauce is, left spilled on the floor. So, I was interested to hear YG themselves describe the situation as one of capitalizing on the early genius that made the company's speakers so well liked. However, instead of just leveraging prior work, YG has a new CEO, Dr. Matthew Webster, who has a PhD in astrophysics from Cambridge. My feeling is that's kind of a so what until YG explained that Dr. Webster's professional focus has been on multivariate computer analysis and simulation techniques. Optimization of brilliant ideas inevitably involves managing trade-offs and managing those trade-offs in the best way possible. And the computer power is now available to do these optimizations if you can write the software. These optimizations are ones that were either prohibitively costly or simply impossible. At least they're now possible if you know what you're doing. So, YG is trying to take its game to the next level with an arsenal of resources not often seen in high-end audio. I was interested to see the results of this approach because, frankly, I've heard some technological wonders that didn't sound much like music. All right, with that preamble about the company kind of under our belt, let's talk about the speakers themselves. YG continues to develop its reference line of speakers, from the Carmel floor stander up to the XV3 with 2 towers, 10 drivers per side, weighing in at 990 pounds. So, these are serious people. That said, I was excited to see YG introduce a new line of lower price speakers, which we were introduced to at Expona. When I say lower priced, that's not to say low priced, but these new speakers are called the Peaks range. With the advice of the YG team, I chose the Talus from the Peaks range, which is in the middle of the 5-member Peaks line. It's a narrow, floor-standing 2-way, priced at $14,200 per pair in the US. Call it curiosity or an iconoclastic streak, my interest arose when I noted that YG historically has explored this floor-standing 2-way concept, and I wanted to understand if it worked, because they seem to think it does. While a 2-way, kind of expensive floor stander may seem odd, I suggest you stay tuned. I also requested the matching Descent subwoofer, partly under the assumption that a 2-way with a 7-inch woofer would have low-frequency extension issues. But since YG made it clear that the Descent was optimized for good integration with the smaller Peak speakers, I was also curious to see if I could achieve smoother bass that addressed some of the inevitable room acoustics issues that everyone faces. Let's talk about the Talus for a second. The Talus weighs 95 pounds per speaker, stands about 40 inches tall and 10 inches wide, although the cabinet, as you can see, is rather deep. A big point here might be that the space consumed by the Talus is about what a stand mount mini monitor would consume. So I think the Talus can be used in many real living environments where the speakers have to be kind of small. Of course, it's your call if the design and the visual footprint work for you. The cabinet seems impressively solid, although of course I couldn't run an FEA analysis. YG stresses that they've put extensive work into absorbing the rear waves of both the drivers at key frequencies so that reflected out-of-phase distortions are minimized. This isn't just a cabinet thing. There are elements of the driver which are mounted right behind the speaker that do some of the absorbing. The shaping of the front panel is also quite sophisticated based on YG testing of the detailed slopes and angles of the panel around each driver. The driver cones and surrounds have also been through YG's new optimization process. I was surprised and honestly pleased that the Talus is rated at 89 dB efficiency, which is pretty sensitive for a two-way with reasonable bass extension. I used the Audio Research Reference 160M Mark II amps for my listening, and their 140 watts per side seemed sufficient to me, with average listening levels of 79 dB, requiring 2 to 5 watts of output from the ARC amps. Remember, big transients require exponentially higher power. A point in favor of two-driver, two-way designs might be that for a given price point, more money can go into each driver, and of course, the cabinet and the crossover, than in three-way or more complex two-way designs. All that said, I like to note that you can't reason very accurately from technical ideas to sound quality. Still, I think you do want to know why a speaker like this might be worth considering, and that's kind of the technical preamble behind this product. Okay, let's get down to sound quality. First, I want to go over my first impressions and my basic setup parameters because that's helpful to understanding an overview of what we're talking about here. I set up the Talus first without the sub. I used my 3,200 cubic foot listening room because I think that's representative of both medium-sized dedicated rooms and shared living spaces where the audio equipment is in the main living room in somewhat smaller homes. Those seem to be the target environments for a speaker like the Talus. I placed the speakers about 8 feet out into the room to move the speaker boundary interference point below the core bass range, while allowing a listening distance of around 38% of the distance from the rear wall. My room doesn't allow it, but it would be interesting to try the Talus very close to the front wall, which might be how you'd have to use it in a shared environment. This would move the boundary interference dip up above the bass range and would also invoke more of the primary room mode or modes that could be advantageous or could be problematic. We'll see in a second. My strong first impressions of the Talus were of exceptional clarity, along with surprising bass extension. Those two things together seem pretty promising to me. Then, with the help of YG's Duncan Taylor, we moved the speakers around to get the best imaging that we could. We ended up moving them about 1 foot diagonally from where I first had them and decreased the toe in, which is kind of a YG recommendation, interestingly enough, so that the speakers were aimed at a spot maybe 8 feet behind the listener. This took us from a good central image that was slightly small to a large, spacious soundstage. It's kind of impressive how much a small change in position can matter to the overall sound staging. Anyway, we went from a speaker separation of about 0.8 times the listener distance to about 0.9, which is wider. And we kept each speaker over 1 meter from the sidewalls because closer spacing to the sidewalls is known to be a problem zone. These details don't matter to you except that they're a reminder of how much small changes can matter and how audiophiles can be aided by the various parameters of setup theory. We tried to apply those as best we could. We then listened to a variety of tracks to get happy with the imaging and with the overall tonality. In this process, Duncan introduced me to an album I hadn't heard of by Colter Wall, who apparently was 23 years old when he made this recording. The album's called Cypress Hills and the Big Country. This kind of, I'd call it Western frontier music, may not be everyone's cup of tea, but Wall has a deep and really resonant voice, which, coupled with a modern recording, make for a useful check on both bass balance and bass texture. Just a brief interruption for some exciting news. AudioQuest has 3 new rack-mountable PowerQuest models that take AudioQuest's comprehensive approach to AC power conditioning, addressing noise linearly to provide class-leading wide bandwidth noise reduction at better than -22 dB. The PowerQuest line starts at $459.95 in the US for the PQ303 and goes up to $1299.95 for the PQ707, which includes transient power correction with up to 45 amps peak on-demand power for any amplifier. Visit audioquest.com for more information. And now, back to the show. With that setup information and those general comments on the sound of the Talus, let's now deal with what I think for some of you will be the elephant in the room, and that is bass, particularly because we're talking about bass in a medium-sized room from a 2-way with a 7-inch woofer. After tweaking, I ran a frequency response measurement from the listening position. I'd previously done a series of measurements at my initial position for the speakers, largely because this helps identify room artifacts, and some of those room artifacts are just not going to be dealt with via positioning, so you can save yourself some trouble and headache. An example in this room of one of those artifacts is the 35 Hz null generated by the dimensions of the room, along with my experience that a quasi-symmetric setup really helps. Anyway, take a look at the graph at the chosen listening position. My main point with this frequency response curve is simply that the Talus, with no sub, has bass in my room down to about 40 Hz. I would point out that there simply aren't that many instruments that go below this frequency, and most music isn't written with the lowest possible notes in mind. Low E, for example, on a bass guitar is 41 Hz. An 88-key piano has 7 keys that have a fundamental below 40 Hz. Kick drum is usually tuned to 50 Hz or higher. My point is, you might not be bothered much by this bottom octave roll-off, assuming your room had something similar. We'll talk later about what you might have to do to get the last octave back. Now, I should be clear that being able to reproduce frequencies and being able to reproduce them at high levels are 2 different things. YG, however, emphasizes that the drivers in the Talus have quite large excursion capability. That's both the woofer and the tweeter. So it's not obvious that there's a problem here, but, you want to check. And to take a look at this, I listened to a wide variety of reference bass tracks. Some examples are Little Feat, the last record album, track 3, is called Long Distance Love, and it has a fantastic, powerful electric bass line that delivers a nice check on lowish bass power. I used Radiohead's In Rainbows album because it's got a standout atmospheric bass line on the track Mark 1, and that needs to be balanced and clean for the track to really work. Alison Krauss has a simple mix on the title track of the album New Favorite, which lets the drum-bass combo deliver some deep and tuneful tones that can easily be buried or blurred. Taylor Swift, on her Reputation album, has some epic bass on the track Delicate. This line is tricky to make clean and detailed while delivering a modern, pretty bass-heavy mix. Let me present a little bit bigger picture of the Talus, because bass is important, but it isn't everything, and it's hugely impacted by room and setup. So, for a broader view of the Talus, let me start with the basic character of superb clarity that I noticed on first listening. That quality held up over time. Instruments up and down the spectrum were reproduced with natural detail and minimal veiling. A lasting impression was also that most instruments and voices maintained their character as the instrument or the voice moved up and down the scale. The overtones of each instrument were beautifully captured. The Talus simply gives the impression that its drivers are very low distortion and that they have a seamless, integrated character. Maybe an attribute of this being a two-way, I might mention. The clarity spills over into the dynamic sensibility of the Talus. This is a speaker that tracks transients very well and makes most recordings with dynamic swings come to life. However, this is a bit more of a mid-range and treble phenomenon than a shuddering columns of air or gut-punching bass kind of thing. The overall frequency balance of the Talus is also well judged. Upper bass through mid-range just seems naturally balanced and seamless. It's a little more complex to characterize the treble. The treble of the Talus is smooth, and instruments have a rightness to them with, again, excellent transient accuracy. I wouldn't say that the Talus is bright in the sense that it doesn't make specific instruments sound colored in the treble range. At the same time, to understand the sound you're going to get with the Talus, you need to understand that it's not a treble-shy speaker. Two examples of this. The Mahler First Symphony, I used the Tilson Thomas recording with the SFO high res, is beautifully illuminated by the Talus. It's got an excellent front of the hall string tone. And this is not a treble-shy recording, but I thought it worked quite well. Turning to Jennifer Warren's the track Bird on a Wire from the sadly, but I have to say it, understandably overplayed Famous Blue Raincoat album. The sound was very dynamic, with the spotlight on the singing, the horns, and the snare. The Talus gives a slightly different, a little bit more upper mid-range tilted balance than you often hear, but I can easily imagine that this is what the engineers were aiming for. If you think about the extensive work done by the big players, big speaker manufacturers I'm talking about, my emerging view is that the treble region, maybe from 3K to 8K, is an area where designers are very much making intelligent but different choices about voicing, and I think many listeners will make different choices with speakers based on these voicing choices. 15 years ago, brightness was a common occurrence, and the major designers recognized it and fixed the problem as they issued new models. But at the level of plus or minus a tenth or 2/10 of a dB, or maybe even more, some current designs are more reserved and some are more relaxed. Some designs are more exuberant. The Talus is on the latter side of the spectrum, the exuberant side. Recordings vary by at least this much, so in making choices about the voicing you prefer, it's going to matter what your library looks like. And I have to note that high-resolution recordings or vinyl, if you use either or both extensively, allow you to better exploit what might be a more accurate treble voicing with speakers like the Talus. That's what I think YG has aimed for. They say they aim for the fun side of accurate, and that seems to fit what they're doing. As for sound staging, I'll simply reiterate that the stage is wide and deep and not especially height limited. In this sense, the Talus does not sound small at all, like some mini monitors can. At the same time, much larger speakers tend to have an even larger, although not necessarily more accurate, image. It seemed to me that with the Talus, instrumental harmonics and hall sound, that's reflections, were slightly diminished versus the state-of-the-art, but this is something you would largely notice by comparison with speakers at 2, 3, 4, maybe even 8 times the price, and only if your room is very, very quiet. To put this in perspective, I think the strength of the Talus in this region is a key reason that you would step up to this price point from speakers below, say, $10,000. Now, I went into some detail about the bass of the Talus alone because I thought that might be a concern. Now I want to come back and talk about adding a sub, primarily in the case of the Talus in my setup, to extend the bass down into the lower octave. It's your decision whether or not that's a important step to take. Adding the Descent subwoofer to the Talus was, I have to say, simplicity itself. You connect the left and right line cables from your preamp, at least in my case, to the Descent and select floor standing or stand mount. There's a little button that you press on the back to toggle between the different modes of the woofer. The Descent uses a DSP crossover to align its phase and frequency response to the peak speaker of each type. These are specific settings. It's not a room measurement kind of DSP system. Of course, the Talus is not clearly one or the other, not clearly floor standing or stand mount. But based on measurements and listening, I thought the floor standing setting led to better integration in my room. Using a single sub is the economical way to go. A single Descent costs $7,800, by the way, although many experiments with subs seem to show that the optimal setup uses 4 subs arrayed around the room. That's an expensive setup, to say the least, and when you look at the optimal positioning, not every room can handle such a setup. In fact, I'd venture that most can't. So I tested with one Descent. YG recommends placing the sub in the same plane as the main speakers. So that's what I did. I had to move the woofer around a little bit from left to right to limit the interference effects and to blend with the room-induced bumps and dips that my room imposed. That done, it was remarkably easy to set the level so that I got extension from 40 Hz down to around 20. In the floor standing crossover position, I set the level of the lowest bass to be a bit below the average mid-range level. My experience is that if you do this, it helps the sub to disappear and keeps the mid-bass cleaner. I got measured response down to 20 Hz at my chosen level. Adding the Descent definitely helped on music with deep bass. Adding this bottom octave and a bit more seemed to open things up noticeably. It's strange, but adding a sub can make the soundstage seem bigger. You just get a better sense of the hall sound. In addition, the sense of rhythm and drive also gets slightly better. The biggest difference I noticed really was in bass textures. Bass textures improved with a sub in place. That's not always the case with subs I've heard. In fact, I would say 3 out of 4 subs lead you to a little bit more opaque kind of bass. All that said, I liked having the Descent in the circuit, and it made some improvements, but I wouldn't say it was transformational. As I said before, a lot of music simply doesn't operate where I was using the Descent. In a smaller room, where perhaps the Talus would roll off at a higher bass frequency, the fundamental mode in my room is at 22 Hz. It could be a bigger deal. Before I would go to spending the money on the Descent, though, I would consider whether this is the most important place to invest given the music I listen to, or really you listen to. The Talus is a quite capable speaker on its own at reasonable listening levels if your room supports bass down to pretty low frequencies. Also, as I alluded to, in my setup, I wasn't able to set the Descent to create what I think is, in my mind, not debatably, but I'm sure some people would debate me on this, to create debatably overwrought slam and shudder effects. Some people want that. At least I couldn't get there without getting bass that has way too much character and way too little realism. Note in this regard that the Descent does not impose a crossover on the Talus. The Talus is run full range when you've got the Descent playing. All right, let me summarize this. The Talus is a lovely speaker. I think it will appeal to users who want a speaker that doesn't overwhelm the room, is close to full range, and is loaded with refinements and capable of revealing musical subtleties. The ability to add a subwoofer built with this specific line of speakers in mind creates a nice option for upgrading or for adjusting the sound balance without getting tangled in a huge optimization effort. I hope you enjoyed this review. If you did, please click on the subscribe button, click the notification bell. This way we can tell you when we're publishing new reviews. In addition, please join us by subscribing to our weekly newsletter. And of course, we would love it if you would join us by becoming a subscriber to the Absolute Sound magazine. We've published it for 50 years now, and it's got some of our flagship reviews on board. Thanks for watching, and we hope we'll see you again.